I've pushed this from my mind in the past couple of months, mostly because any activity has seemingly stopped. Yet somehow I knew this silence was too good to be true, and eventually we would hear from him again, sooner or later. This whole thing started a few months ago. A guy messaged me on Facebook, and unlike the usual creepy messages I get, this one sounded intelligent and funny. We started chatting from time to time, talking about anything and everything. He told me he was divorced with one child, and I empathized every time he would complain about his ex-wife, even though it also kinda bothered me that he would tell all those personal details to a virtual stranger. After all, no matter what happened between them, she was still the mother of his child. I mean, have some respect, right? We continued chatting, and I started to get more relaxed. We were at the stage where we would often discuss our daily lives, and inevitably, I'd talk about my best friend, with whom I'm extremely close. We were almost like sisters, in fact. At that particular time, she was very busy with changes happening at her work, and some issues with a guy she'd met. She said things were complicated, and she would explain the details when there was more time to meet up. Now keep in mind that under normal circumstances, I would have known every little detail about that, but as it happened then, there wasn't sufficient time to properly see each other and talk, so I only knew the basics of the situation. No names, no pictures, nothing like that. So here I am talking to my guy. For the sake of privacy, we'll call him Jake. I start noticing that every time we do, he would casually direct the conversation towards my best friend, Jenna. I had mentioned to him that we knew each other since we were babies, practically grew up together even, so he would always ask me to tell him funny stories from our childhood and teen years, then proceed inquiring about what she's like now, what kind of guy she likes, stuff like that. I would jokingly ask him if he got tired of me and wanted her number, but he would deflect it with awkward humor, so I didn't really think much of it past that. Some time had passed since then, and things were a bit calmer at Jenna's work. We finally got to sit down and meet for drinks. Inevitably, we start discussing Jake. I tell her about him. She's smiling and nodding along until I take my phone out and show her his pictures. She immediately goes pale in the face. She grabs my phone. "This is him. This is the guy I told you about." At first, I assumed she was joking, as she was prone to messing with me somewhat, but she looked dead serious. So I started asking some questions. Turns out she'd met him on a dating app. They talked first, and she was under the same impression I was, that he was smart, charming, cultured, so when he eventually asked her out, she gladly accepted. They went out, had drinks, talked, and everything was fine until the end of the evening. He got a little bit too grabby and insistent for more than just a goodnight kiss. He insisted to drive her home even though she had her own car there, and suggested that he could pick her up in the morning to get her car. Since she didn't want him to know where she lived, and she was annoyed at his advances, she refused and managed to escape him somehow. She had told me she was afraid he would follow her home, so instead she went to a bar where a friend of hers worked after that. The next day he called her and apologized for his behavior at the end of the evening, blamed all the drinks and the stress at his work. Then he told her he had to admit something to her, because he really liked her and wanted to be honest with her. She agreed and they met again. He admitted that he was actually in the process of getting a divorce, but hadn't yet filed for it, and was still living with his wife and small child. She didn't have a job, and he couldn't just leave her alone tending for their child before she was financially stable. Jenna, being the blunt gal she is, called bullshit on his story and accused him of being yet another married man out to cheat and using false excuses for sympathy. Turned out the guy worked as a sales rep, so he was really smooth and convincing. I don't know how, but he managed to appease her doubts, at least to a point of not immediately cutting him off right there and then. Some time passes and he chats to her online, calls her and they talk, but she tells him that the only way she would even consider getting intimate with him would be if she sees proof that he's actually divorced and lives separately from his family. One day he calls her and tells her that he'll put his wife on the phone to prove to her that even though they live together, they sleep in separate rooms and are technically separated. A woman's voice really did confirm that, but it left Jenna more puzzled than reassured. She was conflicted because despite everything, she actually liked the guy and was therefore worried to not get herself into a mess if she fell deeper. She was still hesitant to accept his invitations to meet at this point. One day, he accidentally walked past the place she worked at, exactly at the same time she finished working. What are the chances, right? She agrees to go grab a drink, as long as they talk and act platonic. Apparently, that's also when she tells him about her life more, her childhood. This is where I'm brought into the conversation. He listens intently, and afterwards, when she and I compared timelines, it turns out that exactly a few days after this discussion, he started to message me on Facebook. We were both livid and incredulous, so we decided to confront him separately and then compare our notes together. When I got back home, I texted him, asking why he'd lied to me that he was divorced when he was clearly still living with his family. More importantly, why he started talking to me when he was already seeing my best friend. He was unprepared for that question. He bounced back quickly though, and gave me some bullshit explanation about how he was curious about me when he'd heard so much from Jenna and wanted to see what I looked like. He scrolled through her Facebook friends list and found me. Mind you, at this point she had not added him on Facebook, so he basically stalked her profile to gather that information, just like she never told him where she worked, yet he somehow knew to accidentally walk past there at the perfect time. When Jenna confronted him, he told her that he was just curious and wanted to hear about her from the person that knows her best friend. She told him that it was wrong and creepy on so many levels, but he insisted he had no bad intentions, and that he just liked her so much that his curiosity got the better of him. When we compared notes after that, Jenna and I decided to just stop talking to him altogether. The guy was a heavy liar and was just extremely weird. We each told him that we didn't want to talk to him or see him again, and even though he was shocked and tried to convince us otherwise, he eventually accepted this and said that if we changed our mind, he would be happy to talk. At that point, we thought it was over. Oh, the naivete. At first, he did seem to take it well, but then he would accidentally send a picture or a message which was intended for someone else, but mistakenly send it to me or Jenna, just so he could try and initiate a conversation. He would attempt to ask me or her out again, get refused, then retreat until more and more accidental messages and calls. After a while of this, the random bumping into each other ensued. Wherever we would go, on my way to work, at the market, at a random cafe, at Jenna's gym, he would somehow be there every time. Of course, it was all random coincidence. We started to get more annoyed than anything at this point. We still thought he was just a lying bastard, but pretty harmless, so there was not much we could do, except to wait it out thinking he would eventually move on. How wrong we were. One day suddenly, Jenna comes to my place all freaked out. She tells me she was on a date with a new guy she'd just met when she saw Jake passing by the restaurant she was in. Later, he called her in hysterics, screaming at her, "Look at what you did. I can't get you out of my mind. Because of you, I hit my child, and I chased my wife out of the house in the cold." She got fed up with him, so she told him to never bother her again and go seek a therapist because he clearly had issues. Then she blocked him. That creeped us both out though, because even after blocking him, not only was he not moving on, he seemed to be escalating and getting aggressive. I told her that if he called again, she should threaten him with calling the police and reporting that he was allegedly abusive towards his family. We were in the middle of discussing this when I got a call from an unknown number. Normally I don't pick these up, but I was also waiting for an important package to be delivered, so I thought it could be from the courier company. It was him. He was crying, sobbing on the phone, pleading with me to convince Jenna to unblock him, that it wasn't fair. I had to help him. He sounded insane, to be honest. I was shocked to hear him in this state. It was such a contrast to his normally smooth demeanor, so I calmly told him that he should act like a grown man and calm the fuck down. It wasn't my place to do anything after she'd made up her mind, especially after his crazy behavior and threats about beating his child. He then told me he didn't really do that, but he wanted to make us feel guilty and scare Jenna into talking to him. He started apologizing profusely and said he was at his wit's end and didn't know what to do. I told him this had gone on far enough. He was a 35-year-old male and should act like it. If he ever proceeded to contacting or stalking us even more, I would go directly to the police. I hung up and blocked him as well. The police threat seemed to work finally. We haven't heard from him for about 2 months, but yesterday, Jenna and I were at a birthday party at a club, and guess who was the birthday girl's +1? Last year, I went out of state for my first year of college to a school in Indiana. In the first week, I formed many friendships. One of those was with a boy who would end up becoming my stalker. He was fairly normal at the start, and I genuinely enjoyed his company, as well as his roommates. We eventually became quite close, spending a lot of time together. Soon I had developed friendships with other people, and he became a part of my larger friend group. About a month or so into knowing him, I started to get a feeling that he might like me more than a friend. I still acted normal around him because I didn't want to draw attention to it. The feelings weren't exactly mutual, and I didn't want to ruin our solid friendship. One night, about 3 months into school, everything changed. This night, all of my friends came to my dorm room. At the time, it was a double I was occupying by myself, to drink before they went to a party. I had told my friends that they could drink in my room, but I didn't want to go out because I was very upset by a hurricane that was hitting my town in Florida. All of my friends were very supportive of this, except my soon-to-be stalker. Throughout the time he was in my room, he was making jokes about how dramatic I was being, even when everyone else told him to stop. He just wouldn't let up. Finally, everyone was ready to leave and go to the party. My stalker was the last to exit my room. Before going, he told me that he cared about me, and that if I changed my mind and decided to go out, or if I needed anything, that I should text him. I found this quite strange given his previous behavior, but I figured he had come to his senses and was now attempting to be a good friend. A couple hours after my friends leave, I get a text from another friend, telling me to come help our one friend who was too drunk and is vomiting. I change and walk to her building. Upon arriving, I find out she's fine now, and that they'd already put her to bed. I went outside the building to cry about what was happening in my hometown, on the steps by myself. I got a text from my stalker asking if I had changed my mind. In the moment, I was sad, and figured that maybe if I went out with them and drank, I would feel a little bit better. I told him where I was and asked if the group wanted to meet up. He said they would come, but he arrived alone. He suggested to me that we hang out in my room, but I told him I wanted to go see the group. He didn't seem to be too happy with this. I called one of my other friends to see where they were, and we go to another dorm building where they're drinking. The party was busted, so they'd already left. When we get inside, we had a hard time figuring out which floor they were on and what room they were in. My stalker was visibly drunk at this point, and pushed me into one of the connecting suites that was vacant. He began to make fun of me again for being upset, and became very touchy. I pushed him off of me, and yelled at him to stop. Finally, we found one of our friends. That friend told us we could meet him in his room, and he had alcohol there. My stalker suggested we just go to his room instead, because he was in a fight with one of the other guys and didn't want to see him. I believed this and agreed. When we got to his room, we were greeted by his roommate and a bunch of his roommate's friends. My stalker grabbed a backpack with his alcohol and said we should just go to my room. Our friend group can meet up with us, so we do. My dorm had 2 beds in it. My stalker sits down on the one I sleep on, so I decide to sit on the other one. He put on a movie and everything was normal at first. I immediately began texting my one friend, whose room everyone was in, and told him to bring everyone over to my room. My friends were all drunk at this point, and everyone I texted was not making sense. My stalker hopped into the same bed as me and lied beside me. I immediately felt uncomfortable and started rapidly texting my friends to tell them that he was acting strange and they needed to come now. He saw I was on my phone a lot, so he grabbed it from my hands and told me that I needed to take a 10-minute break from it. During this time, he became very touchy. I told him it had been 10 minutes and that he needed to give me my phone back, but he denied even knowing what I was talking about. I stood up and moved to the other bed because I began to feel uncomfortable. He got up and moved as well. I sat at the very end of the bed, opposite of him, and demanded my phone. He continued to play dumb. Instead, he moved closer to me and tried to touch me even more. I had had enough at this point and told him he needed to give me my phone right now and that this wasn't funny anymore. He told me he needed to go to the bathroom. While he was in there with my phone, I grabbed my laptop and I messaged all of my friends to come to my room ASAP and told them he was being very creepy and I needed their help right now. Once he returned from the restroom, he told me he wanted to level with me and that he thinks we should hook up. I had been making it very clear the entire time that I did not want that and thought he would be able to read my body language and the situation and realize I was clearly uncomfortable. I told him no, and that I wanted to just be his friend and not ruin the relationship. He didn't listen. He came over to me and started playfully grabbing me. I pushed him off and told him to stop. He pushed me down onto the bed and tried to come over me. He grabbed my legs and pulled me into him. I was thankfully sober and was able to kick him away from me and get up and run into the hallway. He didn't chase after me though. He just began to insult me and tell me he never wanted to be my friend in the first place and only wanted to sleep with me, that guys and girls can never be friends. It always has to lead to something more. He starts yelling about how he would never date me, that I'm too emotionally unstable, a slew of other insults. One thing that he especially said that scared me was that he was raised to take what he wanted no matter what when defending his actions. I didn't know what to do. I just started crying and yelling at him to leave my room. He refused and made fun of me for crying. At this point, he still had my phone and wouldn't give it back or leave. I threatened to call the campus police. That finally did it. He agreed to leave. After that night, he texted me every day for a week, trying to talk to me. One of my friends told me to at least listen to what he had to say, so I did. He ended up confessing his love for me and told me he still thinks we can't just be friends, even after I said multiple times that's all we could ever be. Ultimately, I told him I thought we needed to stop talking altogether. All my other friends knew what happened and dropped him from the friend group as well. After this, he spent months trying to talk to me. He became just completely obsessed. I would still hang out with his roommates, but I would only go to their room when he wasn't there. On the few occasions where he would come in, he would later text me paragraphs about how immature I was being for ignoring him. Eventually, I said we could try to be civil and just be acquaintances to be nice, but that led to him getting very mad at me for still acting uncomfortable around him and not wanting to hang out alone with him. At this point, every time I would see him, he would blow up my phone and text me non-stop about me being fake towards him and that I needed to get over myself. Finally, I blocked him. After doing this, he got extremely angry. He would show up where I was all the time and just stare daggers at me. His roommates would tell me he talked about me every night for the rest of the school year. He would try to ask them little things about I was doing and play detective on who I was hooking up with. He even tried to fight a guy who expressed he was interested in taking me out on a date. A few months after the incident, he started making up excuses to come to my door almost every other day. He started trying to talk to me in the hallways as well. He would offer me his things and even buy me random presents. The last few months of school, he told his roommate his goal was to sleep with me before graduation and that he thought I wanted him and was just playing games with him. I in no way did or even made it seem this way. At this point, I only acted completely disgusted toward him. Even over the summer, he was constantly texting his roommates about me. All of my friends told me he started stalking me and recognized that the way I was acting was in no way asking for his attention. I go back to school in the middle of August and he will be there. He'll be living in a frat next year, so I don't have to worry about him being on my floor still, but he still worries me. I think something is very wrong with him emotionally or mentally, and not just because of the way he's acted towards me, just the way he acts in general. I don't want anything to happen to myself or anyone else, and I think I should do something about it. Looking back on that night, I would say his behavior and the things he said were very rapey, and that people who think if I want something I should take it no matter what are at a higher risk to sexually assault someone. I'm a 24-year-old female that moved from Orlando, Florida to 18 miles outside of Valdosta, Georgia in the middle of nowhere, to my family farm. Never had any issues in Orlando, but I got divorced and had to move in with my mom. It was my 2 small boys and I. Anyways, we moved into one of the old farmhouses on my family's farm. It needed a lot of work. It was 8 bedrooms and a mother-in-law suite, I think. When we moved in, we only had 2 rooms cleaned up and worked on the rest of the house over the course of 9 long months. The man across the street, who we will call Jay for the purposes of this story, was actually very helpful. From day one, he would come over almost every day as he was feeding his animals and help with anything I needed. Over the course of 9 months, I never had any issues with him and thought he was just a very friendly middle-aged man. I never once in that entire time felt he had any ill intentions. The farmhouse was in a U shape. The room I chose had windows in the courtyard area. This was the middle of the house. Jay had fenced in that area when I first moved in, so I could let the boys out to play. The farmhouse was in the middle of the farm and set off the road, so I never had any worries of being watched, mostly as my bedroom windows are in a fenced area in the middle of the house. I decided I didn't really need to put any curtains on my bedroom or bathroom. One day, my son was playing under the carport when Jay pulled up in his truck. He was going to look at my car for me. Jay didn't even make it to the carport though, before my eldest son said to me, "Hey, I saw him in my window last night." Later that night, I talked to him. He told me that he did see Jay out a window. I asked him if it was the kitchen window, because you could see his horse pasture and he stopped to feed them every morning and night. And chalking it up to that, I didn't really think too much about it. But other things began to happen. I guess you could say I really wanted him to be the person I thought he was, so I overlooked a lot of suspicious behavior. Stuff like my favorite candy somehow appearing in my fridge one day after school. My mom told me she'd remembered me telling Jay it was my favorite. Someone also began sending me flowers every Friday for a couple of months. I thought it was my ex-husband, or possibly my boyfriend at the time, but neither would ever admit to it. My boyfriend jokingly told me it was Jay. The next day I came home from school with my mom and had the boys playing under the carport. Jay was working on my car. My air suspension had a leak and Jay had offered to look at it before I took it all the way to Tallahassee for extensive repair. When I got out of my mom's car, he asked me if I wanted to see the leak he had found. As I bent over the hood, Jay stepped back. When I turned around, I commented jokingly on his 90s-era cell phone. He had it right in his hand. It's the type you don't see anymore, like a very early camera flip phone. Later that night, we came inside, and my mom told me she could have sworn Jay had taken a picture of me on his phone. It sounded crazy. I know it sounds crazy now, but at the time I really didn't believe her. This man was seriously always friendly, never any weird vibes from him. If I offered to pay him, it was always at cost, and that was rare, as he would not accept my money. I should have known that people just aren't like that these days. I guess I was just really naive. A couple weeks later, I was mowing my courtyard. It was grown up pretty bad. As I got close to my window, my heart literally sank into my butt. I had a newly placed center block outside both windows, and my bathroom window. I can't tell you how, but I knew at that point that I had made a huge mistake, and everyone was right about Jay. I called my friend and neighbor Josh to come look at the center blocks. He ran home and got a deer cam, attaching it to a tree outside my window. This was at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. That night I came home around 6 and was unloading the boys when I turned around. Jay was standing right behind me. "Hey, I didn't mean to scare you. I heard your mama was out of town." I said yes, sir. I knew he knew because they were friends on Facebook. He told me to call him if I got scared or needed anything. I got the boys inside and settled, and we got snuggled into bed. They fell asleep in my bed when I realized I had missed Sunday's episode of Game of Thrones. I went to my mom's bed to watch. I was lying there talking to my ex-husband about the boys and the show when Josh called. He asked if my boyfriend was over. I told him no. This was at 9:02 p.m. He then told me a man was standing outside my window. The deer cam snapped the first picture at 9:02 p.m. My boys were in my room sleeping. Josh told me not to worry. He was already coming up the driveway and to meet him outside. Fear and dread literally drained through me. I slowly walked into my room and calmly scooped up my boys. I shut that door and sprinted through the house as fast as I could. We sat in Josh's truck until the police arrived. The deer cam snapped photos at 9:02, 9:22, and 9:30. He stood outside my window that long, waiting for me to come back. The police walked through the field and could see where he had parked, but by this point he was already gone. I showed them the photos and ID'd Jay. He was arrested at 2 a.m. that morning. When they went through his phone, they found 9 months of pictures. Pictures of me mowing, pictures of me playing with my kids, pictures of me in my bathroom, sleeping, bending over the hood of my car. He had been watching me the entire time. I couldn't and didn't sleep for weeks. He ended up getting out of jail the following weekend and came into my mom's post office. She's a mail lady. He told her he had found my dog dead and buried it for me. Even after that, he only received 5 years probation and a restraining order. He still lives across the street. I stayed only for maybe 3 months after. Then I moved on to Fort Walton Beach.
Moving to Bartlesville, Oklahoma was one of the best decisions I ever made, despite a few hiccups. I took a risk with a job opportunity there, and it ended up panning out for me better than I could have expected. However, the move-in process was everything but simple. Getting all of my belongings from my old home to the new one was easy enough. But the first couple of nights in that house, I felt as if I was being tormented. It was almost to the point where I decided to move out within my first week of being there. Thankfully, I decided against it though. My first day in the house was spent making calls to the propane company to add my house to their route and calling the cable company to ensure that my Wi-Fi was going to be set up as soon as possible. And by the time I was done with that, it was already after 7 p.m. So I decided to microwave some dinner before going to bed. That was when I noticed something that, at first, I thought was just my imagination, but I now realize most likely it wasn't. As I was standing in front of the kitchen window, waiting for my food to finish, I thought I saw something move in the small patch of grass alongside my house. As I said, I brushed it off as some new house jitters and went on to eat my dinner before getting ready for bed. Before going to sleep, I did a walkthrough of the home and double-checked that the front door and back doors were locked and that all the lights were off. And after a long day of unpacking, I was asleep in no time. But as quickly as I fell asleep, I was woken up by the sound of banging coming from the front of my house. I jumped out of bed at the sound, and my heart began to pound as I realized that someone was at my front door. But before I could even get out of my bed, it stopped. I slowly made my way through my house to the front door and looked through the peephole, but surprisingly enough, no one was there. And I would have figured that it was just a prank by one of the neighbor kids, if that was the only incident. But it wasn't. After checking again to make sure that no one was outside of my house, I decided to head back into my bedroom and turn the light off before laying down. Before I could even close my eyes though, I was startled out of my bed at the sound of something banging, only instead of the front door, this time, that sound was coming from the wall right behind my headboard. I ran to the other side of the room and faced the wall that the banging was coming from before calling out, "Whoever's doing this, you better stop before I call 911. And to my surprise, the noise stopped again. Now there was no way that I was getting any sleep that night, so I decided to go into the living room and unpack some more as I waited for the sun to come up. And thankfully, the rest of the night remained quiet. The following day, I made my way into town and picked up some groceries before the cable guy came. And when he did, I spoke to him about the incident to see if there was a problem with the kids in the area or something, which is when he let me know that my house used to be a common hangout spot for squatters and homeless people before it sold. That didn't quite make me feel any better, but at least I could attribute the behavior to someone who was upset that they didn't have a place to sleep that night. However, what came next still shakes me up thinking about it. That night, I watched some TV before going to bed. However, I didn't make it off the couch. I was so tired from the night before that I just passed out as I was watching TV. A couple of hours after falling asleep though, I woke up to the sound of something scratching against the door. And as I listened closely, I could hear the sound of jingling, as if it were someone's keys. And just as I realized that someone was trying to get into my house, I saw the doorknob begin to turn. I stood up from the couch as fast as I could and sprinted toward the door, throwing my entire body up against it to keep it shut. That's when I heard someone step backward on the front porch. I locked the door as I continued to lean up against it, and then I yelled out that I was going to call the police right now. And that time, I actually did. By the time the police got there though, there was no one to be found. They also chalked it up to someone that used to stay in my house when it was abandoned. The only thing they didn't know was how the person got a key. Thankfully, I never had to deal with anything like that again. And after that night, it was as if everyone knew that someone lived there now, and no one ever tried to get inside again. When I was 26 years old, I had finally gotten a new teaching job in Long Island, and my wife, our kid, and I had to move from our home in Rhinebeck, New York, and basically start over. Thankfully, our son was young and had time to make new friends, so that wasn't the problem. The problem for me was that my family had a hard time sleeping in the new house after what happened on the first night. You see, at first, I thought that we were getting an upgrade, moving from a small apartment to an actual house. And when I found out we had an attic, I was excited to have space that I could possibly turn into an office for myself. But after what happened, none of us really liked going up there much. You see, the first day there was awesome. Every house was nice, and our son was excited about the new rooms. But as the day went on, the sun began to go down. Now, when he was younger, my son was very afraid of being alone in the dark, and most nights my wife or myself would end up having to check on him at least one or more times. So when it was time for bed, I could tell that he was a bit on edge, though I hoped that he would be very tired from all of the running around he did in the new house. Sadly, that wasn't the case. After putting him in his room, my wife and I decided to try to get some sleep for ourselves, but we couldn't help but notice all of the little noises that the house was making. I remember telling myself that it was just the house settling, or that it was really windy outside. But in hindsight, I should have listened to my gut when it was telling me that the noises were coming from something else. As I tried to fall asleep, I kept hearing one sound which to me was particularly strange. Coming from right above me, every couple of minutes I could hear the subtle sound of something shuffling across the attic floor. Again, I tried to pass it off as something normal, like a raccoon or something that got into the attic. But as the night went on, I began to freak myself out more and more. And when I heard the sound of something creaking out in the hallway, I began really thinking that something was off. That was when I heard it. The sound of my son yelling from the other room as his door slammed closed. I didn't waste any time getting out of bed and running toward the doorway to check on him, with my wife closely behind me. And as soon as I opened our bedroom door, I could see what made him scream. I looked out of our bedroom and saw someone standing in the middle of the hallway right in front of the door that led up to the attic. My eyes widened as I saw them looking toward my kids' room. I screamed at the top of my lungs as I ran out of my room toward the intruder. I used all of my weight to push him up against the wall as I yelled for my son to stay in his room and for my wife to call the police. The man struggled and tried to get me off of him, but I was full of adrenaline from the experience and I had never held on so tightly to something in my life. We both sat leaning against the wall until the police finally arrived. The police came and questioned the man, who we found breaking into our home. And according to what the intruder told the police, he was actually the previous owner of the house. He claimed that he forgot a box of his wife's jewelry in the attic and was hoping to get it back, but after carefully looking for it, neither my wife nor myself ever found any jewelry box in the attic, and we ended up pressing trespassing charges against him. Nothing like that ever happened again, but for the next couple of years, any noise that my house made basically put me into a state of panic. Living in San Antonio has its ups and downs. The plus side is that the price that I pay for rent is less than half of what I paid in California. And the bad side is some of the strange people that live in the neighborhood. Honestly, if I didn't have a roommate, I don't think I would have lasted past my first week here. Now I'm much more comfortable, but I'll never forget that first week. I had just moved into my apartment, which at the time was a decent-sized 2-bedroom apartment in a small complex. I shared the apartment with a friend of mine named Zeke, who I knew growing up. He had lived there a year prior to me moving in, but after his roommate left, he asked if I wanted a change of scenery, and I thought that it would be perfect. When I got there, it was great to see him and catch up, and it was even better when I saw that my new room was practically the size of my old apartment. The only issue that I had with the room was that the window didn't have a screen in it. Other than that, I loved it. The first 2 nights that I was there were great. We grabbed some food and I met some of Zeke's friends, as well as I interviewed for a job that I ended up getting. But then came the 3rd day. For the first time I had been in Texas, it actually wasn't smoldering hot outside, and I was able to open my window to air out my bedroom. As time went on, I ended up forgetting that I opened the window and ended up heading into bed that night with it still open. My room was a nice temperature, so I was able to get comfortable and fall asleep really fast. I just wish I hadn't been such a deep sleeper. The next thing I remember is waking up facing the wall that my bed was up against when I felt movement on the bed behind me. At first, I thought it might have been Zeke or something, which irritated me. So thinking that I knew who it was, I turned on my bed to face them and tell them to get out of my room. But even though it was dark in the room, I could tell right away that it wasn't Zeke in my bed. My eyes widened and my mind went blank. I totally froze as I noticed a stranger laying in my bed right next to me, just staring right at me. After a second, I finally came to my senses and was able to let out a loud scream, hoping that Zeke would hear me from the room and come to help. The man in my bed didn't like that I yelled though, and he immediately lunged toward me. I tried to fight him off, but he was too quick, and he had my mouth covered by his hand before I could do anything. That didn't stop me from trying to scream out as loud as I could. Even though they were muffled, I knew that someone would hear something eventually. Thankfully, it only took a few seconds for Zeke to come barging through my bedroom door. The man who had been in my bed jumped off of me at the sound of my roommate busting through my door. Zeke tried to grab a hold of him, but he was able to push Zeke to the ground before climbing right out of my bedroom window. I jumped out of my bed and slammed the window shut and locked it before calling the police. According to the officers that came to the apartment, they couldn't find anyone, but I wasn't the first woman to call in the area. I guess there were 3 other break-ins over the 2 weeks prior to my incident. After that night, I never opened that window again, and thankfully, once our lease was up, we both ended up finding an apartment in a much nicer and safer complex.